Hey there, Pastor Farney here, coming to you with the next in our series on the Book of Concord. We have made it all the way to Article 23. Article 23 is entitled The Marriage of Priests. So it sounds like this would be a fairly short article, kind of snappy and quick. But as it is, it actually expands to touch on something a lot broader, kind of a broader theme of the Reformation. And one that I think is actually very helpful, even for lay people. Now, I will warn you that this is a very fitting article for today because I have little Adelaide with me. That's why this recording comes late. If you were looking for it last week, she's a Reformation scholar. She's working on her PhD on the Book of Concord. So bear with her if the recording seems to have some starts and stops. But we'll be looking at this article today. This actually has one of the longer sections in the Apology, so we'll just be looking at the one article. And we won't go through kind of line by line in the Apology as we've done for many of these articles. But we'll get started here in the confession itself. We'll remember that we are here in the second part of the Augsburg Confession, which talks about abuses, right? In the first part, the Reformers say, here is just doctrine. Here's our doctrine. Here's what we teach. We think this is actually in keeping with what the church teaches. Some people have been wrong, but it hasn't been the teaching of the church. I don't know that they would write that today, kind of retrospectively looking back. I don't know if that claim is kind of historically well-founded, or I think it's just kind of a matter of perspective there. But these later articles, including the one we're looking at today, are labeled abuses. They're saying these are things that administratively have gone wrong in the church, and so we are bringing them back into order. And they're making the case that the emperor should kind of legally be enforcing these things, right? And you'll remember again that they had a very different view of the separation of church and state than we might have in our context today. It was the emperor's job to make sure the church was running well and well administrated. But we will go ahead and we will read this Article 23 on marriage of priests. Paragraph 1. Complaints about unchaste priests are common. Well, we could say a lot about that already, but we'll see even more of this. This will be a big theme. That one of the biggest reasons that this reform has been enacted is because the priests are not able to remain unmarried. Platina writes that it is for this reason that Pope Pius is reported to have said that although there are reasons why marriage was taken away from priests, there are far more important reasons why it should be given back. Pope Pius, actually a fairly recent pope in the time of the Reformation, only perhaps a century or less before. Since our priests wanted to avoid these open scandals, they married wives and taught that it was lawful for them to enter into marriage. First, because Paul says, because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife. And later, it is better to marry than to be aflame with passion. And this is kind of a fun passage to translate, because Paul doesn't say it is better to marry than to be aflame with passion. He says simply, it is better to marry than to burn. Now that probably means, with lustful passion, kind of a metaphor there. Paul's not afraid to use those. But it may mean kind of to burn in the fires of hell or something like that. It's possible. I do think this translation is probably appropriate. Paragraph 5. Second, Christ says, not everyone can receive this saying. It's from Matthew 19, where he teaches that not everyone is able to lead a single life. God created human beings for procreation. It is not within a person's power, without God giving a unique gift, to change this creation. So the Reformers are making the exegetical case here, the case from the Scriptures and from the Scriptures teach, that it is the normal and natural state of man to be married, to procreate. And if a person is not given to that, that is only by a special gift of God. It is not really a choice. So you don't really have the freedom to choose whether you are to marry or to remain single. Each is a different gift of God. For it is clear, as many have confessed, that no good, honest, chaste life, no Christian, sincere, upright conduct has resulted from the attempt to lead a single life. Instead, a horrible, fearful unrest and torment of conscience has been felt by many until the end. Therefore, those who are not able to lead a single life ought to marry. No human law, no vow can destroy God's commandment and ordinance. For these reasons, the priests teach that it is lawful for them to marry wives. And so, here's another one. Hi, Zoe. Give me a second. Sorry about that. Zoe really loves Book of Concord class and is a bit heartbroken to be put out, which gets at something we'll talk about a little later, about why the church decided ever to restrict the marriage of priests. We'll get there in just a second. It's clear that in the ancient church, priests were married men. Paragraph 11, Paul says, an overseer must be the husband of one wife. 400 years ago in Germany, for the first time, priests were violently forced to lead a single life. They offered such resistance that when the Archbishop of Mainz was about to publish the Pope's decree about celibacy, he was almost killed in a riot by enraged priests. This matter was handled so harshly that not only was marriage forbidden in the future, but existing marriages were torn apart, contrary to all laws, both human and divine. This was even contrary to canon law itself, as made by not only popes, but also the most celebrated synods. So Melanchthon makes a few points here. In the first case, and this is kind of a historical fact beyond doubt or argument, in the early church, in the ancient church, priests were married men. This is abundantly the case. In fact, Paul's passage from 1 Timothy chapter 3, an overseer must be husband of one wife, may well mean that marriage was obligatory for priests, that in fact it was necessary for the priest to be married. It's not completely sure that it means that, but it's at least possible. And it's sure that it means that this was an option, and in fact, a very common option for pastors in that time. And it wasn't until about the 12th century that this custom comes to Germany. And it comes not from within the clergy saying this is a best practice or something, because otherwise, these guys get wrapped up with their kids, and you got to pay them more so they can support a family, and you can't kind of have them on call quite as much 24/7. All valid complaints, and I think reasons that Rome today restricts the marriage of priests. What's wrong, baby? You're okay. But this comes to Germany in the 12th century, and it comes just by decree, and this poor archbishop was nearly killed. He calls together the priests and says, hey guys, you can't get married, and if you are married, you have to put your wives away. Your marriage is dissolved. And they go, okay, we're going to kill you, because that's not acceptable. Imagine how you'd react if someone came and said, hey, you have to kick your wife out, right? Probably wouldn't be too pleased with them. And this was, of course, illegal in every type of law. It's against the law of nature, against the law of the empire, and even against the law of the church. So very violent, kind of ridiculous burden laid upon the church. Paragraph 14, though, more to say. Seeing that man's nature is gradually growing weaker as the world grows older, it is good to be on guard and to make sure no more vices work their way into Germany. Now, I want to bring up here, I know he says it later, and he's especially, he'll bring it up in paragraph 18. One of the reasons that celibacy was not very well looked upon by the Lutherans was that it simply wasn't working. All that was forbidden for these men was that they would be married. Now, as you may well know, hi, sweetie, you don't have to be married to, shall we say, engage in marital activities. You don't have to be married to have children. You don't have to be married to go and visit the whorehouse. And all of these things were happening among the clergy, and they were creating you imagine the scandal of any of these things, and they were common and widespread, and I'm sure that worse than these were going on and becoming public knowledge. And so marriage becomes not really much of a scandal in comparison to those things. I know it's an outrage, but this is what was happening in Germany. So the reformers said, well, priests are nowhere prohibited to marry except by a newfangled decree of Rome, and so we don't see that serving the church. So why would we continue doing it? Sweetheart. An interesting case here in paragraph 14 that the world is getting worse and people are becoming less able to kind of keep their passions in check, the fathers might say. And so this was good to be on guard against more vices working their way into Germany. They're pitching this kind of a moral reform that this is making Germany a better place, right? Would you rather have married priests or women on the corner, we'll say, right? And the choice is obvious. Furthermore, 15, God ordained marriage to be a help against human weakness. Canon law itself says that the old rigor ought to be relaxed now and then in these latter times because of human weakness. We wish this would be done also in this matter. We expect that at some point churches will lack pastors if marriage continues to be forbidden. A little bit prophetic there. We see that the Catholic Church didn't immediately collapse, but I think there's been kind of a long-standing lack of priests there. Not that allowing pastors to marry has really made things too much better in the Lutheran Church, but I imagine it would make things worse if they turned course on that. It actually used to be the case that a man studying to be a pastor it wasn't quite forbidden, but it was very much frowned upon to be married while you were in seminary, until even about probably the oldest of these guys are still pastors and are towards retirement. But eventually they started saying, well, if I come back from vicarage with a wife, what are you going to do? Kick me out after 3 years? You know, the church needs pastors. And so that's kind of fallen by the wayside for the best. Paragraph 18. While God's commandment is in force and the custom of the church is well known, impure celibacy will cause many scandals, adulteries, and other crimes that deserve punishment from just rulers. In light of all this, it is incredibly cruel that the marriage of priests is forbidden. God has commanded that marriage be honored. Marriage is most highly honored in the laws of all well-ordered commonwealths, even among the heathen. But now men, even priests, are cruelly put to death, contrary to the intent of canon law, for no other reason than that they are married. Paul in 1 Timothy 4 said that the doctrine of demons forbids marriage. This is clearly seen by how laws against marriage are enforced with such penalties. Now, I haven't looked down in kind of an academic source to see just how right Melanchthon is on this. If he's got firsthand knowledge of men being killed for contracting marriage, or if this is kind of hearsay. I actually think he knows that this is a true thing, that people are being hanged, priests, for marrying. And so you see why he's kind of incensed about this. You know, this is not worth killing people over a custom of the church. We'll get to the end of the apology, or the confession here. 24. Since no human law can destroy God's command, neither can it be done by any vow. So Cyprian advises women who do not keep the promise they made to remain chaste, that they should marry. He says, if they are unwilling or unable to persevere, it is better for them to marry than to fall into the fire by their lusts. They should certainly give no offense to their brothers and sisters. And even canon law shows some leniency towards those who have taken vows before the proper age, as has been the case up to this point. So you see here kind of a preview of some of the arguments that we'll look over in just a bit more detail as we look at the apology. In the first place, that human law does not trump divine law, the natural law, so to speak, nor do vows, kind of monastic vows, are they able to abrogate the divine law, right? If God says you should be fruitful and multiply and gives you no further gift or instruction to the contrary, then it doesn't really matter what vow you make or what law you make. You must marry. and if you kind of go against that sort of natural law, there will be consequences for it. Namely, these scandals that have sprung up that the reformers are so sensitive to. At this point, let's turn our attention to the Apology and look at these arguments in some more detail. Before we get there, I promised that this wouldn't just be kind of self-serving. Although you remember Melanchthon, I don't remember if he gets married, but I do remember that he's not a priest. He is kind of a lay theologian, and he is not forbidden to marry. So you kind of ask yourself, well, why is he so concerned? Not just, that we're doing this and it needs a defense, but he gives quite a long defense. And I think what that gets at is something a little bit more fundamental in Reformation theology, and it's the idea of vocation, right? That God's people have a calling. Each of God's people has more than one calling, and they are all divine. They're all from God, right? It is not just the pastor, the priest, who has a divine call from God for what he does, but also the plumber and the accountant and the teacher and the truck driver and all of every, as they say, every righteous profession is ordained by God and is given by God and is holy to God, right? Do you think God wants people, to starve to death? No, the farmer does God's will of feeding people. And not only kind of occupational callings, but also the callings of father and mother, of sister and brother, of parent and child, right, of husband and wife. These too are all things that God has commanded, given commandments towards, and has sanctified. He said, this is how I want the world to work. I want mothers to do mother things. I want fathers to do father things. And that this is holy and good. This is the will of God. And they'll contrast that with kind of an idea that, well, yeah, I guess God's fine with those things, but what God really wants you to do is renounce everything and go and live in the monastery and pray and garden all day. And the reformers will initially be kind of okay with that, but the more and more they kind of get to it, they'll say, you know what? God never commands you to go off and do that. He commands you to have children and feed them and change their diapers and cut your neighbor's grass and these sorts of things. And these aren't just kind of what would you say, a limp-wristed moralism, but this is doing God's will. And so when you do that, you do a good thing and a Christian thing and the holy thing. This is kind of what's behind all of this and the kind of real payoff of this. To say nothing of removing scandals from the clergy, and you see it's not totally workable, but we certainly have different scandals in the LCMS than Roman Catholics do. Those sorts of things, and Melanchthon will make the point also. Clearly, these men are not living holier lives. They're in fact living less holy lives because of this decision. I've got to scroll my page here, but my thumb is well in use by the baby. Let's see what we can get done. So we won't go through all here because, as I said, it's a very long article. It's about 72 paragraphs and quite long paragraphs. So he makes this point about divine and natural law. He says, God gives us the command to be fruitful and multiply. God ordains marriage. But celibacy, while God speaks highly of it, he does not command it to everyone. Excuse me. Later he'll make this point. Chastity is a higher thing than marriage. It is better than marriage. But this kind of false chastity, one that is not a gift from God, but is one you kind of take upon yourself, that is no higher than marriage at all, but in fact is a perversion and an insult to marriage and chastity, both. But it is clear from the scriptures that those who do not marry have a special gift from God and have more time for prayer and good works. though he'll make the point, and this is strange that he would have to make this, they're not therefore justified, right? This is not what saves you, is being unmarried or something. It is, of course, faith that saves you. Again, kind of odd even that kind of question would come up. But he says quite well that, well, there are plenty of unmarried pagans, and they'll go to hell. They will not be saved. And there are plenty of married Christians, and they will be saved. I mean, these things are not as the opponents have represented them. It kind of gives you a feeling for what kind of, how do we put this kindly, what kind of garbage they were dealing with from the other side. Hi, sweetie. You're okay. Here. Suck my thumb. Okay, let's see what else we have to say. They'll make the case from church history that it's really a late development, and there are plenty of kind of local places that this doctrine has come up as we kind of look towards the defense of it today. If you ask Roman Catholics today, especially the theologians, well, why do you do this? This isn't in the Bible. God doesn't command us to do this. And they'll say, you're exactly right. This is not a doctrine. This is a discipline. They say we choose to do this, and we could at any time change our mind. And I think it's kind of defensible. I think it's still an unwise way to conduct business, but at least they're now making the case that, well, no, God does not command that priests must be unmarried. That's our own decision that the church decides. Okay. Now, as far as historically this goes, Melanchthon will concede that this topic comes up very early in the church, and even at the Council of Nicaea, a party was bringing forth the idea that they wanted to ban the marriage of priests. I mean, they wanted to do this. This is 4th century. This is 325, right? When they do the creed, it wasn't the only thing they did. They also weigh this matter. It seems not very long, and they reject it, which is notable. That the church that writes the creed also says, no, we will not accept a proposal to forbid priests to marry. We don't think that's necessary everywhere. You guys can do that in your parish, do what you want, but for us, we can't make that a universal law of the church. And so you see further on later, in certain places, certain kind of local synods or local councils, they may come to these decisions that, hey, the priests in this area are not to marry, but it's not until fairly late, at least 10th century, 11th century, that this becomes kind of universal in the whole Western church. It never really takes off in the East. And so the Reformers making the point of, look, this is not the way it's always been everywhere. This is not an always and everywhere kind of doctrine like the Trinity, right? The Trinity, always and everywhere, people have been teaching this. If sometimes some people were teaching it, it'd be a very different thing. But the marriage of priests has been kind of just like a local custom, right? Like what color you use during Advent or something. There's a right answer to it. It's whatever we do. But it's not something that's binding on the whole church. They make some points. They appeal to Paul, who says that those who forbid marriage are teaching the doctrine of demons. They make a very, very interesting, and I don't know that I would have made this point, that in Daniel 11, this hatred for women is a mark of the Antichrist. And they go, oh, I don't know if that's what Daniel means, but it's very interesting that they would argue that way. Okay. The opponents make some reference to the Mosaic Law, and there's this passage there that says that the Levites, remember the Levites, these are kind of the, what would you call them? They're kind of like the ushers, you might say. They're doing things like security, they're cleaning up, they're helping to prepare the sacrifices. They're not the full-time priests, those are the sons of Aaron. But they're very much involved, and it's kind of a it's kind of a seasonal thing, right? You'll get called up for a season, and you'll go do your Levitical service, and then go back home. You probably have some other job, right? And so during that time that they're serving, they are to stay away from their wives, right, for kind of ritual purity reasons. And Melanchthon will make the case. First of all, that's kind of ridiculous. Why would that have anything to do with modern day priests? But also, this was temporary, and these men were married. They were still married at the time. They were just, well, as Paul says, depriving one another mutually for a time for prayer. So he kind of does away with that argument, and he picks up all of these places where. Maybe I'll back up a little bit. It's interesting that the Reformers, very indebted to St. Augustine, the early church father, and they kind of carry with them, this is interesting, you can see they're kind of moving out of it as they write the confession, this idea that sex in and of itself is an evil thing. I shouldn't say evil, a sinful thing, that there's no way for it not to be sinful. Even within marriage. Even within marriage. Now, the Reformers aren't going to say that, but it's clear when you read them that they kind of grew up in a tradition that would say that. This is Augustine. Augustine's usually pretty solid. He's pretty weird about that. And they'll say, but God kind of overlooks it during marriage. He closes his eyes and he goes, well, it's worth it for procreation. Things like that. And so Melanchthon will draw on passages from Paul, like 1 Timothy 4, that it is made holy by the word of God and prayer, that all things are made holy by the word of God and prayer. And so marriage itself is cleansed through faith, and when it is received with thanksgiving. He sees 1 Corinthians 7, the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife. So on, and this is interesting that they would bring up what is, I find, a very difficult passage, but I think they really explain this quite well. Sometimes they take biblical passages and I say, well, I probably might not have explained it that way, but I see why you did. But this 1 Timothy 2:15, it says, she will be saved through childbearing. It's talking about the woman, and you go, what do you mean do women gain salvation by bearing children? Some have interpreted this to mean, she will be kind of preserved in the act of labor. Probably not. Probably actually doesn't mean that. It's probably more difficult. But here's what they say. This is paragraph 32. I'll just read it to you wholesale, if she'll let me. Likewise, she will be saved through childbearing, and so on, 1 Timothy 2:15. If the adversaries could produce such a passage about celibacy, then certainly they would celebrate a wonderful triumph. Paul says that woman is saved by childbearing. What more honorable thing could be said against the hypocrisy of celibacy than that woman is saved by the conjugal works themselves, by conjugal intercourse, by bearing children, and the other duties? But what does St. Paul mean? Let the reader observe that faith is added, and that domestic duties without faith are not praised. He continues, he says, if they continue in faith. And so it reads, she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith. For he speaks of the whole class of mothers. Therefore he requires especially faith, through which a woman receives the forgiveness of sins and justification. Then he adds a particular work of the calling, just as in every person a good work of a particular calling should follow faith. This work pleases God because of faith. So the duties of the woman please God because of faith, and the believing woman is saved who devoutly serves her calling in such duties. And so you see here a wonderful understanding of this text, that he reads it in the context of a vocation. The woman is saved through childbearing with faith. And so it could be said that the garbage man is saved through collecting garbage, if he does so in faith. That in all these things, faith is worked out in keeping the vocation, in the calling, even this calling of mother, which is kind of looked down upon if you don't think highly of marriage. I would not say such a thing because I'm terrified of my wife. We'll go on here. He goes on quite a bit longer. He talks about kind of purity of the flesh versus purity of the heart. He talks about this justification issue in paragraphs 36 through 39. Hi, sweetheart. He talks in 40 about why celibacy is a better thing than marriage, namely because you get a little more time that way, as you can see. That example of the Levites, paragraphs 41 and 42, as I have mentioned. Okay. He brings up this example of kind of sort of different heresies that have come throughout the church. The early heresy that kind of doesn't really have a name. It's hard to sort out what it is, but it's clear that the Colossians were dealing with something. And what we know from Paul's letter to them is that it seems to be the sort of thing where marriage was looked down upon. And this seemed to be kind of a work of the flesh that really merited salvation, they thought, was abstaining from marriage. And there were all of these kind of ascetic cults that say, you want to stay away from that stuff. And so the opponents were saying, well, you guys are, the reformers are saying to the opponents, well, you guys are acting like those heretics that are praising chastity and saying that marriage is evil or sinful. Something God has ordained should not be evil or sinful. Later, Melanchthon will bring up that the reformers are being accused of spreading the heresy of a man named Jovinius, and Jovinius was teaching that he was actually speaking about the married life quite highly. In fact, he said it is a higher thing than chastity. He's wrong, but he's not really that as offensive as like an Arius who's going to say that, Jesus is not God. His heresy isn't that quite clearly offensive. He's wrong because he contradicts Scripture, right? But the reformers will say, there were very different debates going on at that time, and they were talking about just totally different issue, and so what we're teaching is not what he is teaching. It's a totally different conversation about kind of temporary celibacy, permanent celibacy, those sorts of things. Okay. I don't think there's much more that's too worth our time here. The last thing I'll say as we close up here is that as we think about kind of what this looks like in the modern day, because this is a pretty this is one I run into a lot, right? I'm out wearing a clerical, and someone will say, "Oh, Father, how are you?" And I'm great. How are you? The Lord be with you. And then they'll maybe see my family follow behind me, and they'll kind of look very confused at me. All that to say, this is kind of a very notable difference between Lutherans and Roman Catholics or Anglicans or those sorts of folks. And I think if you find yourself talking to a Roman Catholic about this, I think it's wise to admit, yes, certainly, you could pay me less and you could get more work out of me, and I'd be happy to do that if I did not have a wife and kids, right? This would be a better recording because my kid wouldn't be screaming through it. And so why do we allow priests to get married? And it is a few kind of bullet point reasons. We've touched on all of them. In the first place, the Word of God does not prohibit priests to be married, and the ancient church knew of this custom, and they seemed to do just fine. Right? Paul says that the other apostles were married, and he alone went without a wife. It also, in many ways, this is an argument I brushed through in the Apology. Paul seems to talk as though a man who is married will gain some experience from running a household that will be very helpful in running the household of God. And so that is kind of a practical in that sense is that having children gives you, if you haven't had kids, it gives you some experience. You learn some things. And those things may well be helpful in administering the church. But what the Reformers see is kind of the number one upshot of all of this is what it teaches the people about marriage, is that it does not seem that the priests are too holy for such a sinful thing as marriage, but it says that no, marriage is a wonderful thing, it's a beautiful thing, and it is a way to serve God. And this is, I think, the real lesson of Article 23, is that it is not holier to be a priest than to be married, but each thing is commanded by God and a great blessing in the church. Okay, I'm going to get this baby to sleep, and we'll see you next week. And as always, we would love to see you on Thursdays if you're ever available. But until then, God bless you.